Okay, hello and welcome to the virtual forum on water withdrawals, transfers, sustainable use, and policy in Indiana. I'm Jane Frankenberger, professor of agricultural and biological engineering at Purdue University, and I'm one of the people who planned this forum together with the team that you see listed on this slide. It's a joint effort of the Purdue University Institute for a Sustainable Future and the White River Alliance. Late last fall, we started hearing about a proposal to create the LEAP Lebanon project that would develop about 9,000 acres into an industrial park near Lebanon. Large amounts of water for this industrial park, up to 100 million gallons per day, would be taken from wells near the Wabash River in Lafayette. Now, large withdrawals like this are not uncommon. There are locations around Indiana where water is withdrawn, used, and then discharged back into the river. What's unusual here is that after the water is used by industry, it would not return to the Wabash River, but rather be piped into a tributary of the White River, possibly Sugar Creek or Eagle Creek, down to the Eagle Creek Reservoir or somewhere else. Thus, it's not just a withdrawal, but a water transfer. And this raises a number of questions. First, there's a concern about groundwater. So how would such a withdrawal affect local groundwater? And would it harm those who already use the groundwater or impact future development locally? Second, because of the proximity to the Wabash River, there's also a concern about surface water. How would this withdrawal affect the Wabash and the return flow affect the stream into which it's discharged? And third, will someone be determining the answers to these questions? And will they have enough data to inform the decisions? So these are the science questions, but pressing policy questions have been asked as well. First, if the analyses showed that the withdrawal would be harmful to those who use the water today or will in the future, and I want to be clear that this is not the case for the Lebanon LEAP withdrawal, would it be allowed? And here I think you'll hear that the answer is, for the most part, yes. So the question for each of us to think about is, are we happy with this situation? And if not, what policy changes could be implemented to protect our water resources from future unsustainable withdrawals or transfers? So this forum is the result of our asking these questions and bringing together experts in water science and policy to address these important yet difficult water issues. We don't have the answer to all these questions, and that should not be surprising because in-depth studies take time and money, and they have not been done. But what we decided that what we could do is focus on sustainable water use more broadly. So you will not hear the pros and cons of the specific LEAP Lebanon water transfer proposal, but rather we use that project to provide a context for looking at how Indiana currently manages water use and how we may create policy to manage it better in the future. So our forum has three parts, each about 30 minutes long. First, we'll hear from the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, the agency that manages water rights in the state. And we're pleased to have two experts who think and speak about water law regularly, Mark Bash and Ryan Miller. Next, we have two scientists, Ginger Davis and Keith Chirkauer, and they'll look at how well our data and information needs for sustainable water use are met, or what else we need. And third, we'll look at a few potential policy options that Indiana might consider to advance sustainable water use. So Ohio has a permit system for large consumptive water uses, so we'll learn about that. And in Indiana, a bill was introduced in the legislature this year that would have required a permit for withdrawals over 10 million gallons per day. And we're privileged to hear from Representative Mike Aylesworth, who introduced it. So each of these sessions will end with a question and answer period, and we hope that you'll engage with the discussion by typing in the Q&A box at any time. We'll also have the chat available, but it will not be monitored. So you need to use the Q&A box. So welcome again, and I'll now turn this over to Jill Hoffman, Executive Director of the White River Alliance, who will provide some more context and also introduce our first two speakers. Thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Jane. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you here on a sunny Friday. What I thought I would do is just spend a very brief few minutes giving you some perspective about why groups like ours get involved in conversations about sustainable watershed management. Here's a quick look at Indiana's regional watersheds just to help orient us. And then I'm going to share just a few slides with you to get you caught up on what it looks like when some of the significant water users are clustered into one watershed, the one I'm most familiar with, the Upper White. So here are our regional watersheds. You're probably familiar with some of those better than others, but here's a look at the one I work in regularly. This watershed, the Upper White River watershed, the West Fork as some call it, is home to about a third of the state's population and has several major tributaries, about 15 of them actually, that make up the drainage into this area. So we're quite familiar with sharing water across subbasins inside of our regional watershed. I'd like to just briefly introduce myself and our organization, since we're co-hosting this today and always want to make ourselves available as a resource for all of you about water issues. So we are a multi-stakeholder organization, a nonprofit who focuses a lot of our work in central Indiana. However, we do support programs that run statewide, including the Indiana Water Summit and a public education program called Clear Choices Clean Water. So again, I'm Jill Hoffman. I'm going to just walk you through a couple of examples to warm up our minds before we hear from all of our great speakers about what it looks like when we have major users in one watershed as an example. So in our watershed here, our river and our aquifers are used collectively to do all kinds of things, from recreation to drinking water to industry, both food and beverage and manufacturing, and even irrigation of both residential lawns and agriculture. That water use, a good portion of it is supplied by a pretty diverse aquifer system. So as you're hearing from our scientists later today, just a reminder as we talk about water policy statewide, our underground resources as well as our surface resources are not exactly created equally. And oftentimes the availability of these resources is what drives different users into a particular area to use water. So here's a quick look. You can see the White River Valley running through the center of this as the area that has the largest capacity to pump from our underground systems. And if we take a quick look at the next map here, this is our same watershed. And I'm just showing you something that my friends there at DNR are going to launch into, and that is our significant water withdrawal users registry. And so, again, just warming up our minds in the Upper White, what it looks like when we have folks proposing to use more than 100,000 gallons of water per day. They engage with the DNR and report annual information. And this is a look at what happens. And you can kind of see from that previous map that White River Valley that runs through the center of our watershed then becomes a hotspot for these large water users to either pull water from the surface water resources, which we call intakes, or from the wells. And those can range in volume use quite substantially across the watershed. And so this is just an example of kind of how it works if you're looking at one of our regional watersheds in particular. To warm you guys up further, just wanted to point out who these folks are. So as we talk about water use, we understand that it is not just our public supply we're talking about, such as these users, our municipal users, but it's also our power and light, our energy companies are among the group of users. And then, of course, health and hospital, research, large industry. You can see there health and hospital type things, and Eli Lilly and other folks that use water for manufacturing of products. Then, of course, we have a lot of large water users that are in this group because they are doing mining operations. So you can see some of those move in here. And then also, of course, recreational users like golf courses and such. So just a reminder as we're talking today that these group of significant water users are a bit of a snapshot of what our life is like in any one of our watersheds. They're folks that are providing jobs, power, water supply, recreation, just a number of different things. So it is a balancing act across different stakeholder groups, and that's why we like to host conversations like this. So with that, I would like to just point out one last piece of the puzzle as we work on water management. The Indiana Finance Authority has been conducting studies on availability and demand of water. And I would just encourage you to check some of those out, because those studies then help us understand not only what our current availability is, do some of our subbasins have excess water, but what does our future demand need? And if we forecast that demand out, do some of our subbasins then have a shortage of water? So I won't spend too much time on this map. Just wanted to tee up your interest in checking out those studies, because science is at the foundation of answering these challenging questions that are in front of us. With that, I would like to remind you that this webinar is part of a larger part of our efforts at the Alliance to host conversations that are cooperative and focused on sustainability, and to please join us August 10th and 11th at the Indiana Water Summit, where we'll dive further into many of these topics. And on behalf of the Alliance, as we get going here, thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the second half to moderate our discussion on policy. I've got one more slide, it looks like, because I have the pleasure of finally introducing our first set of speakers, two gentlemen that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. I'm glad that you guys are here. Mark Bash is the head of water rights and use at the Department of Natural Resources, and Ryan Miller is the Deputy Director of Regulatory Services, also at the DNR. So just like to welcome these two guys to our forum today. Thank you so much for sharing how things work inside the agency, and we're looking really forward to hearing from you.
Great. Thank you, Jill, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ryan Miller, and today Mark Bash and I will be presenting a brief overview of Indiana's regulatory framework as it relates to water quantity issues. We'll do our best to answer all of your questions, and if we can't get your questions answered today, our contact information is included in this slideshow for the webinar, and we're happy to follow up if we can't get to those today. Next slide, please. So like most Midwestern and Eastern states, Indiana recognizes a system of riparian water rights, where use of surface or groundwater is associated with the ownership of land adjacent to or overlying surface or groundwater sources. So that's a key point to Eastern water rights versus Western water rights in law. Indiana code specifies that water must be put to reasonable and beneficial use, and waste of groundwater be prevented. And Indiana code also defines beneficial use as many of the following water use sectors that you saw Jill identify already within the White River Basin, but also includes domestic users, agricultural users, definitely industrial, commercial, power generation, conservation, public water supplies, water for environmental purposes such as waste assimilation, navigation, fish and wildlife, and recreational uses of those water resources. As part of our responsibilities, the Department of Natural Resources conducts assessments of the water resource, takes and maintains an inventory of significant uses of water withdrawn from both surface and groundwater sources, and plans for the development, conservation, and use of the water resource for beneficial uses, much like the Central Indiana water study that Jill just referenced. With that said, I'll now turn it over to Mark, who will further describe Indiana's water rights and use programs and the Indiana Water Shortage Program. Thank you very much, and Mark, take it away.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm going to real quickly go through some of our water resource programs that we have here at the Department of Natural Resources, specifically water rights, the water use program. As you can see here, the significant water withdrawal facility program that we have, Jill's already talked about that, the high capacity registrations and water use reporting. Talk real briefly about groundwater and surface water rights, and then just touch on the water shortage plan at the end there a little bit. So again, Indiana's water use program, the registration program that we have for significant water withdrawal facilities is under 1425-7. And this particular statute actually is one of my favorite laws since I was hired because of the requirements in this statute. Enacted back in 1983. Section 15 of this law discusses and requires the registration of all significant water withdrawal facilities. Those are both groundwater and surface water. Definition of a significant water withdrawal facility has already been mentioned, is 100,000 gallon per day capability. This can be an aggregate of wells and intakes. The statute also requires an annual reporting of water use. This is done actually by March 31 of the following year for all these facilities. Currently, we have about 4,270 registered facilities, although I think I just saw the most recent count, and I think that's up closer now to about 4,290. So, but we have that many registered facilities here in the state of Indiana currently. And the map gives you some idea of how those are distributed. The red dots, or as they look like blobs because there's so many at this scale, are wells. The intakes, surface water intakes, are shown in blue. Just a quick overview. The significant water withdrawal facilities in the state of Indiana are broken out into 6 water use categories. And those particular categories on the left here, as you can see, energy production, industrial, irrigation, miscellaneous, public supply, and rural use. You can get a feel for how many of those facilities are registered with us. Obviously, irrigation, as you can see, is the most predominant. About 2/3 of our registered facilities are in this category, most of these being agricultural irrigation. And again, you can see here too that a facility can contain more than one well or an intake. We have about close to 7,500 wells that are registered with us, and close to 1,300 surface water intakes. And kind of hot off the press somewhat, the 2021 water use data. Again, data is submitted to us by the significant water withdrawal facilities by the end of March of the following year. It gives you some idea of the amount of water that is withdrawn in the state of Indiana in any given year. Obviously, last year we had about 2.1 trillion gallons of water withdrawn by the significant water withdrawal facilities, the 4,270 that we have registered. As you can see, most of that water withdrawn is surface water. About 1.9 trillion gallons withdrawn in that particular water use category, and then groundwater about 219 billion. So again, what's interesting about our water use program is that we are registering capabilities. You guys probably, most of you know, and gives you some idea of how much water is used and what that represents in terms of what could actually be withdrawn in any particular year. And you squish all that 37 years of data into one graph, which is, I think, pretty amazing. And it gives you some idea of the total water use in the state of Indiana reported by the significant water withdrawal facilities. Again, 1985 was the first year of water use reporting. And you can actually see a reduction, obviously, over the past 20 or so years. A lot of that is due to a couple energy production facilities being taken offline, as well as some reduction in use by industry, some of the conservation methods that they have, and other water users. So again, we do see that kind of that downward trend, but we peaked at about 3.6 trillion, I think, in about 2001, and now dropped off, as you saw, to about 2.1 trillion this last year from these significant water withdrawal facilities. Again, that kind of gives you a feel for the water use program that we have. Jumping into the water rights part of our discussion here. Again, talk real briefly about Indiana's groundwater rights law, Indiana Code 1425-4. And this particular statute provides for timely and reasonable compensation to small capacity well owners against the impacts of high capacity pumping. Also, the law gives us authority, the Department of Natural Resources authority, to restrict high capacity pumping under certain conditions. And again, this law really is predominantly, again, a high capacity wells affecting a small capacity well. Most of the time, those are domestic wells that are being affected by the pumping. Again, the differentiation between high capacity and non-high capacity is that 100,000 gallon per day capacity registration that we have. So theoretically, the facilities that are potentially impacting folks would be registered with us as a significant groundwater withdrawal facility. Again, time and reasonable compensation is pretty limited, and it's specific to basically getting the individual who is being impacted, the small capacity well owner, back into their normal supply of water. And generally, that is done, as you can see here, by reimbursing them for the expenses that it requires to get them back into their normal supply of water. And again, typically what happens, as you can probably guess, is if we have a domestic well that's failing, the individual will either have the pump lowered in that existing well, sometimes upgraded a little bit capacity wise and dropped to accommodate for the lowering of the water level, New wells are installed at times in order to accommodate a lower water level in an area. And again, the high capacity user, of course, has the ability under this particular statute to restrict their pumping and then to allow water levels to recover, and then allowing the small capacity well to fail. As you can imagine, this generally isn't the option that's taken because it doesn't really resolve things, long term. So most of the issues that we have with well failures are usually handled by either lowering pumps, putting in new wells, or at times, if utility water is available, of connecting somebody to that water supply. So again, that is generally what is done in order to correct these issues. The one thing that I think that's important to point out, the water rights law, of course, is going to have a compromise the legislature put in place, where if the well was installed, the domestic well, small capacity well was installed after January pretty much of 86, that it has to meet some minimum construction standards. And again, this is to allow for some impact to the water resource and to a domestic well by the high capacity pumping, and somewhat of a cushion that would be allowed. And again, for a domestic well, let's say that was put in after 86, if it was put in a sand and gravel aquifer system, it has to have 20 feet of available drawdown, meaning the pump has to be set 20 feet below the static level at the time the well was installed, or in a bedrock aquifer, that 50 feet of available drawdown. And again, this would be required if the small capacity well owner wants to have protection under this statute. This is somewhat of an optional thing, or was an optional thing under the water rights law, under Rule 312, IAC 12 for years, until the last 10 or so years, the well construction standards that regulates water well drillers was put in place. That now requires this 20 and 50 feet of available drawdown. Again, I mentioned about the restriction of groundwater withdrawals as another possibility under the groundwater rights law. And as you can see, the requirements for that, the criteria that have to be met. One of those, of course, where there would be a situation where a domestic well was impacted by high capacity pumping, and the high capacity water withdrawal facility owner did not resolve that in a timely and reasonable manner. And number three, as you can see, there's a reasonable belief that continued groundwater withdrawals would exceed the recharge capability of the water resource of the groundwater resource. And this particular provision of the law has only been utilized once, back in 1988 up in Jasper, Newton County in northwestern Indiana, where restriction of pumping took place for 3.5 days out of the week. The irrigators couldn't pump, and they were allowed to then would continue their operations for the other 3.5 days. This has been the only time that the statute has been in place that there has been a restriction of high capacity groundwater withdrawals. Again, there's a similar statute, a surface water rights law, kind of looks just like the groundwater rights law, 1425.5. And this particular law deals with protection of what's called freshwater lakes against significant water withdrawal facilities. And you can see the criteria for that the lake has to be at least 10 acres in size. It says of natural origin. There actually should be an or there, or originally constructed to retain water, and that lake has to exist at least 5 years before the high capacity pumping operations that were taking place. So again, it's a documentation of a significant lowering of the lake level, and also that high capacity facility has to be within 1/2 mile of that freshwater lake. It's kind of a two-pronged statute. What we have to document first, that there's been this substantial lowering of the level of the lake, and that this lowering would result in significant environmental harm. And again, this is specified in the rule 312.11.5. Generally, when we make an investigation, and this law has been in place since about 95. When we make an investigation, it usually involves a biologist who would evaluate the potential impacts of that lowering of the water level. And finally, just real quickly, I think we got a couple minutes here. The water shortage plan, I'm going to briefly touch on that. Again, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Indiana's water shortage plan, but this plan really is, as it's stated here, kind of a coordinated response to water shortage conditions in the state. And again, typically this is called a drought plan, although the water shortage task force who developed this back from 2006 to 2009 wanted to make sure it was called a shortage plan for other reasons rather than drought, that there might be some issues with regard to water availability. And the plan sets out some voluntary conservation options in order to avoid or reduce the shortages. Also provide some resource tools. There's a model ordinance within the plan that can be and has been used by different entities, typically public water supply systems, in order to deal with water issues during a drought. And then also the plan provides a priority of water uses. Again, this plan was put in place actually in 2006. It was called for an update of the existing plan, which actually a lot of folks weren't aware that we had one back in '94. A water shortage plan was put together, and it lacked basically the requirements for water use priorities, as well as kind of an implementation method. And so the legislature called for the Water Shortage Task Force to be named and to update the existing plan to this current plan, which would then include these criteria that you see here. So again, as I mentioned, the plan is kind of a coordinated response to water shortage conditions, and it provides for different methods of water conservation. There's 3 phases of the plan. Actually, I think there's 4. There's the normal phase, which would be where there'd obviously be no no conservation methods at all, but there's the watch phase, the warning phase, as you can see here, and then the emergency phase. Again, the watch phase and warning phase would be actually implemented with the cooperation of DNR and Homeland Security and IDEM and several different agencies. The emergency phase actually would only go into place with the governor's declaration. Again, the actual water shortage warning phase, we had a couple times where that has actually been implemented. Back in 2010 for several counties in the southern part of the state, because of the dry conditions at that time. There was, I think about 26 counties that were notified of this warning phase. And then in 2012, if you can remember, the dry conditions, then the entire state was actually in a warning phase. But in both of those years, an emergency, groundwater emergency, or the water shortage emergency, was never declared. Again, there are the actual plan sets for some allocation priorities, as you can see here. Again, the domestic purposes is the top priority. Health and safety. Again, power production is up there in 3rd. 4th is for industry and agriculture with contingency planning. 5th is for, again, for either the 3rd or 4th without the contingency planning. And these particular priorities actually were pulled right out of the rule for withdrawals of water from state finance reservoirs in order for the, as far as the contract requirements for those facilities. And again, as you can see, the 6 priorities for any other purpose. So again, I know I buzzed through that pretty quickly, but by my watch, it looks like it's right about time. So appreciate you all listening in, and I'm guessing we have maybe a few minutes of questions and answers. Thanks.
We do. And thank you so much. And there's Ryan. So I think we'll have lots of questions. But the first one I'm going to ask is the one I asked in the introduction, which is that if there was an analysis that showed that a water withdrawal would be harmful to an existing user, and let's count as a major user as a start, would it be allowed?
You want me to take that, Ryan? I'd be happy to. Or...
You can start and then I'll elaborate. But what I want to start with is under riparian water rights, the right to beneficial use of a water resource by a riparian is allowed. And so typically, if there would be a dispute between 2 riparian users, the courts would determine what constitutes beneficial. So there's nothing currently in state statute that would prohibit it, as we don't permit water uses for riparians, but that's typically a remedy that is sought. Mark, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
That sums it up well. Again, there are certainly a lot of new water withdrawal facilities that are put in the state that there's anticipated going to be impacting folks, and the water rights law would then obviously require wells to be upgraded, and we have that quite often.
Okay, thank you. And you touched on the question that so again, these questions were asked in the registration. Some of you put in questions there. So I'm just starting with some of those, which is what legal avenues are available to mitigate the impact. So it sounds like that would be the remedy if, say, a city's water supply was impacted by a new user. Is that right? They would go to court?
Well, they could. Hopefully that there could be a remedy, as Mark described, where the two entities could work out a solution together. And that's what Mark described, several domestic users who had been impacted by a significant water withdrawal facility. Those remedies are typically investigated and sought out. So those are typically after the fact. Mark, is there anything more you'd like to add?
No, I think, again, that's it. As I think Jane is implying too, this water rights law is high capacity impacting non-high capacity. So when they are two high capacity facilities, potentially, then the water rights law would not be applicable, and would be a remedy that you're talking about, Ryan. Yeah.
Okay, and just to follow up on that, we had another question from someone that said, I am a homeowner that lives less than 2 miles from the proposed well field. First, they ask, what effect will this have on residential wells in our area? And I think you can't answer that one. But the question is there some kind of baseline monitoring that can be done to be able to determine the impact after the fact?
Yes. In fact, a lot of what we do are documenting water levels for domestic well owners that are concerned about a new high capacity groundwater withdrawal facility. And again, the well would have to be accessible, and we'd have to get into it. Don't have to, however, the water rights law doesn't require that. It's an after the fact thing. So if there was a well failure, even if we hadn't documented a water level prior to the high capacity pumping, we would still be able to evaluate it.
Okay, thank you. And that's great because you're the person that does it. So I think that's wonderful to know. And that certainly will be of interest to folks. All right, now I'm going to take some of the questions that are in this Q&A. First, what's meant by waste of groundwater that's to be prevented? Do you want to say, you said that that's what the law is, right? Prevent waste of groundwater.
I might jump in here again. I'm not an attorney, but certainly I think when you look back historically at Indiana water law, I know one of the big cases was the issue down at French Lick, and where there was a kind of a wanton use of water withdrawals, groundwater, just to gratuitously impact a neighbor that someone didn't like. So I think in that case, the waste of water was just being done for that particular purpose. I think what Ryan had already kind of talked about in the first slide was the uses, the beneficial uses of water, and meets those criteria. Then that's certainly something that would be recognized as a beneficial use.
There was another, Jane, if I can just jump in there, there was another question in chat that I was trying to answer, but I didn't get to. And it was on the first slide when it was talking about the beneficial uses, and it mentioned energy conservation. That should have said energy conversion. So the use of water, beneficial use of water and energy conversion, think about a hydropower facility, converting kinetic energy into electricity. So that's really what it focused on. So I apologize for the typo, and hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you. I have another question on notification requirements. So does someone planning a new large water withdrawal need to inform IDNR or anyone else before they drill the well or before they start pumping?
I can jump in there again too. Again, that's part of our significant water withdrawal facility registration program that's handled by Allison Mann of our office. The significant water withdrawal facility registration is after the fact. So once the well is installed and equipped with pumping equipment, the well itself is not what's being registered. It's really kind of the pumping equipment, whether it's groundwater or if it's surface water intake, same thing. They are required to register that within 30 days after it's been installed.
Good. And I think that's helpful because I've heard a number of people say with the LEAP Lebanon proposal, why weren't we notified, right? So that's not in our law currently. Now some of the questions are a little hard to see, but okay. Let me ask Martins, will an existing high capacity well limit or prevent a future nearby high capacity well be installed? And in other words, is it first come, first served?
You want that, Ryan, or?
I will say no, but if you have two facilities that are looking at installing high capacity wells, regardless of what the use is, you're obviously going to want to try to limit the influence or impact you have on each other. So well spacing, those are pretty typical technical details that are looked at when siting a withdrawal location. So there's likely, if there's an existing well, hopefully there'd be some drawdown data in the vicinity so that wells could be spaced at a location where both significant users could operate efficiently. So that would be my answer. Mark, I don't know if you'd like to add to that.
I think that says it perfectly. Yeah, there's no priority of water use, and no first come, first serve, but certainly, that those evaluations are done in order to put the wells in and make sure they have properly producing wells. So.
Okay, so now we're back to the small capacity well user who, as you said, would get compensated. And the question is, will provision of the deeper well include replacing the pumps and compensation for the increased cost of power to get to a deeper depth?
Yeah, and this question comes up periodically. We've looked at it over the years with, again, certainly a deeper pump setting would require a lot of times, not always, but you say you're stepping up from a 1/2 horse to a 3/4 horse submersible pump in order you get too much deeper in 120, 140 feet or so. And that would be part of the timely and reasonable compensation of doing that. The actual cost of that pumping, again, we have not seen that to be really very substantial. So typically we're just looking at pump replacement, pump lowering, again, replacing an old pump with a new pump, which is something the law allows for. And again, or putting in a deeper well to accommodate the lower water levels.
Okay, here's a question. How much water is actually leaving the state? So I'll just ask, do you have any idea of that? Is that something that you keep track of?
Like a statewide water balance? I mean, I think.
No, I mean through utilities, not through rivers or something like that.
Leaving the state.
From the major water withdrawals, how much of our water goes to another state? Of the water withdrawn, how much goes to another state?
Well, I guess the only thing I could think of, and we have this question every once in a while, Ryan, we've talked about it, where there's a couple utilities that are kind of on the state line. There's one down at West Harrison that actually withdraws water from Indiana and discharges to Ohio. And then we have one up around Cayuga, the same type of thing where it's a public water supply system. That water is reported, that water withdrawals are reported to us, and we'd be sure to get a look at that. Certainly no prohibition to that. But and then other water withdrawal, particularly up in the Great Lakes area, certainly could be some, a lot of water moving around up there with the public water supply utilities. So, that's something we probably could try to get a handle on, but certainly the data is available for the facilities of West Harrison and the Cayuga.
I think to add to the response, I think maybe the question to frame up is what's the net gains losses, right? Because you're going to have water entering the state too, perhaps from those same types of uses you were asking about exiting the state. So I think what may be more meaningful is looking at a balance of gains versus losses.
Yep. Okay, we'll have to find out about that. But our time for this session is up. So sorry for those who had good questions up, but I think we're going to go ahead and move on. We're going to have more time at the very end to have questions on any topic, depending on how much time we have left. So we'll go back to these, or you can ask some others. But otherwise, our next part is going to focus on what we know and what we don't know, and then data we have and don't have that we need to be sure that we are sustainably managing our water resources. And so we have two other speakers now who will each speak for about 10 minutes. And then again, we'll have time for questions and also for you to share your thoughts. And so you can type in the Q&A box at any time. So our first speaker is Ginger Davis, who's a research hydrogeologist at the Indiana Geological and Water Survey. And she is going to talk about groundwater, these questions, and she'll be followed by Keith Chirkauer, who is a professor of agricultural and biological engineering and also director of the Indiana Water Resources Research Center. And he's going to focus on surface water. That's how they've split it up. And thanks to both of you for putting together, without an in-depth survey, we know that you haven't done a great deal of research on this, but putting together what we know and what we need to know. Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you, Jane. I think I need control of the slides unless you want me to just say next slide. Thank you. So again, my name is Ginger Davis. I'm a hydrogeologist with the Indiana Geological and Water Survey. The survey is a research institute that conducts research, surveys the state, collects and preserves geological specimens and data, and disseminates information to contribute to mitigation of geological hazards and the wise stewardship of energy, mineral, and water resources in Indiana. So it's my honor today to talk a bit about the work we're doing, and I believe it all comes down to the balance of water within our state. I like to start with our conceptual model, the high-level view of water resources in the state, and I love to utilize the new water balance or water cycle image that USGS puts together that indicates the different pools and fluxes, or what I like to say as storage and movement of water through the cycle. If you look at this image in detail, I encourage you, when you're thinking about Indiana, to focus on the area that is not within the mountain ranges, but more of these flatlands where we see agricultural use and industrial use of our waters, but also the groundwater soil moisture system. Groundwater and soil moisture being those storage areas and pools where we hold water, and then the evapotranspiration, agricultural use, groundwater recharge as the movement of water from the different reservoirs into different places within the water cycle. So one of the researches that we do here at the survey is keep an eye on the water balance. We are instrumenting the state with different hydroclimatic monitoring, which includes soil moisture and recharge to get a handle on recharge. We also monitor precipitation, wind speed, temperature, and humidity to get an idea of moisture in the atmosphere and where it's moving to, whether up or down. And then also groundwater and groundwater wells. So when we look at a water balance, we're basically accounting for where water moves through the system. And I like to say this is our fund banking system, right? So this is where water goes to be stored in our groundwater system. That's the bank. And then the withdrawals and deposits that are made through either pumping or atmospheric withdrawal from evaporation, or then deposits through recharge and infiltration through the soil moisture. So this is all based on our geological foundation and the geological framework that makes up our system that water flows through when it hits the ground. I'm specifically wanted to point out the area that we're speaking about today. So I pulled in some old research that some of the folks here at the Geological Survey, when we were part of DNR, fun known fact, along with some of the professors there at Purdue University, and some division water folks like Mark Bash and Ryan Miller. And so this was a research that was done back in the 80s and 90s as to look at the Taze River Valley, which is a deep buried bedrock channel underneath our modern day glacial units. And so a couple cross sections were made by these researchers to take a look at the different types of units that were below the ground in these areas, and the different prograde and recession of glacial sequences within these to make up different units within the ground. So we have a buried bedrock channel that is primarily filled in this part of the state, which you can see. This is the kind of north-south transect along the western edge of West Lafayette and Lafayette. And this indicates that in the deep bedrock system, we have a valley-filled aquifer with coarse gravels and sands that are embedded with some silts and loams. And we think about these coarse gravels and sands as being our aquifers. This is where water can move through the groundwater. This is our storage area for the water within the ground, because there's plenty of pore space between these sediments for water to move. And these are capped off by tills, which are a mixture of different sediment sizes that can cap and kind of resist the movement of water, and also protect from contamination. So this north-south transect kind of indicates that down deep into our system is some of these coarse sands and gravels, whereas interbedded, discontinuous, intertilled sands and gravels do occur in the upper units, but are very discontinuous and limited in dimensions, both laterally and horizontally, laterally and vertically. So here is a big picture of this valley, this deep valley that runs through the northern portion of the state. And USGS and DNR cooperated it back in the day to collect some core samples and do some analysis. And you can see over on the Ohio side, it's pretty much the fine materials, which do not allow for water flow, whereas to the east, you have much more coarse materials that do allow for more aquifer storage. Specifically in the area of Tippecanoe County from Benton through Carroll, we can see how these materials were deposited through various different drill holes that are provided in that area. I kind of colored them so that it would be a little bit easier to see, with the gravels being gravels and sands being our two aquifer systems that can be relied upon. Now these units these units showcase how thick the units can be over on the Illinois border, but they do taper off as you move to the east. And in the West Lafayette area, the valley has cut through some of those capping units to expose this deeper system a bit more, and so it has more readily available to that water. Another project that has been conducted in Indiana is the potentiometric surface maps that DNR participated in, and I did as well when I was back at DNR. And this kind of shows the direction of water movement across these lines. You can think of them as contours for water. And so in the Tippecanoe area, water is moving from the southeast to the northwest to that Wabash River Valley system. And the contours are fairly narrow spaced, so you've got quite a steep gradient. Down just adjacent is Boone County, where our Lebanon area is, and you can see that Lebanon is on a high groundwater system, and so water is now moving in multiple directions in the groundwater. But these are all part of more shallow system where private wells are located, and maybe does not inform as much on that deeper bedrock system, especially since the deeper bedrock system does not lie below the Lebanon area. So we do use monitoring wells to try and capture the information from these areas and try and capture data as to what groundwater levels are doing. I would say that, and based on some statistics that USGS and others have done, that we do not have enough groundwater monitoring wells, especially at various depths. This image here is a map of our groundwater monitoring wells within the state. The smaller diameter circles and squares are shallow, either bedrock or unconsolidated glacial or alluvial materials. and the larger and darker squares are the deeper. So you can see there is a very wide spattering of different depths and different types of wells, but not enough to accurately characterize our aquifers within the state or monitor them. Some of the monitoring that has been done, this is one of the aquifers that is monitoring that deep bedrock Taze system. And you can see, at least since the real-time monitoring in 2007 has been conducted, that the trend of the water is declining, with obviously some droughts impacting that. We love to see that rebound and recharge of the aquifer of the water coming back up after droughts, but we are seeing a steady decline in those water levels. Two of the other monitoring wells in this area are some of the middle and shallower aquifers. So this is one of the shallow aquifers. This would be more where a private well would be located. And we aren't seeing that same trend here, or the limited data that we have available for the middle aquifer there. So the last slide I want to talk about is these consequences of overwithdrawal. There are many, and they have been misunderstood and not characterized within the state. And I'd like to impress on you the importance of characterizing these things before we overwithdraw any aquifer. The reduced capacity for future needs, subsidence or settling or release of pressure from water will cause sediments to compact, reducing the long-term capacity of aquifers for storage. Oxidation changes can change the chemistry of the aquifer and encourage some releases that may be harmful for human health. You can also have lowering of water levels that impact the critical infrastructure of private wells, lowering of lake levels or changes in streams to go from perennial to possibly dry streams. And with that, I think it's a good time to turn it over to the surface water talk that Keith's going to give. And I'll take questions after our two are done. Thank you.
Thank you, Ginger. So I'm Keith Turkauer, professor in the School of Agricultural and Biological Engineering at Purdue University, and also the director of the Indiana Water Resources Research Center. And I think Ginger gave me a nice introduction, working from underground in the aquifers, and I'm going to try to tie it together by talking about surface conditions. And we've seen these plots of well, Mark showed these. This is surface water withdrawal, significant water withdrawal facilities across the state, surface water in the middle, groundwater on the right-hand side. I've also brought in a population map for Indiana, so you can see a lot of the intensity for water withdrawals is related to population, but also agriculture in the northern parts of the state. The little orange squares that have now popped in are kind of the area that we are talking about as far as this proposed Lebanon LEAP transfer. Switching to here, again, now we're looking at groundwater and surface water monitoring. So these are 30-year trends from 1992 through 2022. So we've talked about some of these locations already. Whoops, wrong. Gotta remember to push the button. There we go. Again, the orange square is showing what the area we're talking about. And then here we have the Benton 4 well that Ginger was just talking about, as well as the Tippecanoe 18. So you can see Benton 4 has a downward trend in water level, water availability. Tippecanoe 18, upward trend. They are very close together when we look at this map of the state. But as Ginger pointed out, they are they're at different depths and in different parts of the aquifer system. If we look at the surface water, there is a gauge here on the Wabash River at Lafayette, and there is one here at Covington. So we're going to look at those when we look at the potential changes to Wabash River flow with the proposed level of withdrawals. And you can see that surface water in general is increasing. There are some areas in the northwest part of the state that are decreasing, but much of the state is seeing increases or has seen increases in surface water over the last 30 years, whereas groundwater is very much a mixed signal. Oops, oh, there we go. I had those labeled too. So to do this part of the discussion, I want to approach this by looking at scenarios for withdrawals. So what I'm going to talk about in the coming slides is an analysis that assumes that all of the water for these proposed withdrawals is going to be pulled directly from the Wabash River. Okay, the proposed riverbank infiltration system that we're talking about will really only draw a fraction of its water from the river. The rest will come from the underlying aquifer. We won't really know what percentage of river versus aquifer is being pulled until they put test wells in and take measurements. So this is really kind of getting at kind of a worst case scenario for the rivers involved. I will point out too that estimating the impact on the local aquifers in a similar method, or using a kind of a similar methodology, really requires far more detailed data that we have, and so I can't do that for can't do the same kind of analysis. The scenarios that are evaluated as part of this presentation are between 5 and 100 million gallons a day being withdrawn from the Wabash River upstream and downstream of the transfer location. So LEAP Lebanon is most likely going to be transferring between 5 and 10 million gallons per day, because that's what most industrial high capacity systems are pulling. But if you looked at, say, 10 such sites, you would get between 50 and 100 million gallons a day. And I know that there have been some newspaper reports saying that 100 million gallons a day would be moved for this LEAP Lebanon. So therefore, I am looking at 4 scenarios: 5, 10, 50, and 100 million gallons a day. I'm going to start. So again, we have Wabash River at Lafayette is going to be upstream of the proposed withdrawal location. Wabash River at Covington is downstream. And I'm just going to put this up. This is the last 30 years of daily stream flow. And yes, the stream flow with 100 million gallons a day, 50, 10, and 5 are all on this plot, and you really can't see the difference, right? So we are not talking about a substantial overall removal of water from the Wabash River, even if all of this was pulled directly from the surface water. If we look at it as a percentage of current flow, then 5 million gallons per day pulled from the Wabash River at Lafayette. It's more than 0%, but is not very big. If we get up to the 100 million gallons a day, we are getting close to 2% of annual flow over this 30-year period is being taken out of the Wabash River and transferred to Lebanon. If we move downstream to Covington, where the river is bigger, we're under 1 3/4%. So again, not a huge amount of the average annual amount of water is going to be transferred. Okay, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect, right? So how and when might these transfers affect flow in the Wabash? In order to see that and quantify that, we really need to consider extreme low flows. And so I'm going to do that by using what's called the average minimum 7-day consecutive flow, or 7 consecutive days of low flow that occurs once every 10 years. This is also referred to as a 7Q10, and it is a threshold used by a lot of agencies for identifying extremely low flows and those that pose an ecological risk. In particular, Indiana has code that when the river flow is below its 7Q10, normal water quality standards may cease to be applicable. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but it is such a low flow that regular monitoring and concerns about water quality may be put to the side for a period of time. So if we look at days over the last 30 years when the Wabash River has been below 7Q10, in the observed record at Lafayette, that's 69 days, and at Covington, that's 74 days. If we start pulling out 5 million gallons a day, Lafayette moves from 69 to 73 days. Covington stays about the same, much larger quantity of water there. As we move up in the amounts of withdrawn, if we get up to 100 million gallons a day, we're about twice as many days that fall below the current 7Q10 level, and almost as many at Covington. And if we look at how those days are distributed across the last 30 years, right? 2012 was a big drought year. We had a lot of days in the observed record that were under the 7Q10, almost over 40 at Lafayette. If we pull 5 million gallons a day out of the river, that hardly makes a dent in that. If we pull 10, we do see that we get a couple extra days. If we're doing 50 or 100, doesn't quite double the number of days under the 7Q10, but it does change the number. And the same with many of these others. And so there are years when if we were withdrawing 100 million gallons a day every day, that we would actually be under the 7Q10 in a year when it wouldn't have been naturally. So there is an impact for that withdrawal if we are considering extreme low flows. The other thing that we need to consider with this process, because this is a transfer from one watershed to another, is that the industrial use, that once the industrial use is done, that water is going to be returned to local surface waters. Industrial use is mostly non-consumptive, which means that most of that water will still be present when its use is done, which means it's going to be returned to nearby water bodies. Irrigation would be an example of a water use that is mostly consumptive, where most of that water is not going to be returned because it has been evaporated and used to grow plants. Return water is most likely to be added to local surface waters, streams, lakes, and reservoirs, because recharging aquifers is difficult. So therefore, when the water is pulled from the Wabash and taken down to Sugar Creek or White River, it is most likely to be returned to the surface water system. So again, the scenarios I'm going to show in the next couple of slides assume that 100% of the water transfer is returned to streams near Lebanon or near Indianapolis. And I know our next speaker in the next section is going to talk about how much water is actually consumed in industrial processes, so I'm not going to get into that, but I'm going to assume 100% is being returned.
Okay, so we just have a minute or two, Keith.
Sorry. It is our worst case scenario. And so we are looking again, right, not many wells and not many stream flow gauges in here, but we're going to look at Sugar Creek and Eagle Creek. And so if we look at the percent of annual discharge, if we return that amount of water, Prairie Creek, which is in Lebanon, we're talking a substantial change to the amount of water in that creek, with 5 million gallons a day up to 100 million gallons a day, 350% increase in the water volume in Prairie Creek if that water is returned there. In Sugar Creek, even 100 million gallons a day, we're talking maybe addition of 25% of daily stream flow. Eagle Creek, being smaller than Sugar Creek but larger than Prairie Creek, falls in between. And then if we look at change to extreme low flows, I couldn't do counts under the 7Q10 because once we start pumping these waters into all of these rivers, the old 7Q10 is no longer valid. Nothing falls below it. So this is showing you how the observed 7Q10, which you can see for Sugar Creek and Eagle Creek because they're large enough to be displayed, are overwhelmed by what would be a new 7Q10 because that water has been transferred into the system. And then I just want to wrap up, right, to remind you that those scenarios that I presented are extremes, but they are something that we can do with the surface water system, something we cannot do with the groundwater system. That all of this is neglecting surface groundwater interactions. They are very important, but they are poorly understood in this area. My general statement, Indiana has plentiful water resources, but they are not evenly distributed. And that is why we're having these conversations about moving water from one watershed to another. And my final point, right, in order to have a better understanding of what is happening in this system, we have to have better observational records. Thank you.
Okay, and thanks to both of you for providing really a lot of a lot of information, even though you haven't had a chance to study this in depth because we haven't had, research projects. But that last point was really one of the points we wanted to make sure everybody heard, that Indiana needs more observations. So I think this really helped. I'll just pull out some of the questions. There are some really interesting and complicated questions here. Emily asked near the beginning, and this would be for Ginger. So capacity is not indicative to the amount of available water. Question mark, is there an aquifer mapping program? Is that something you can answer, Ginger?
So yeah, aquifers have been mapped in the 2D by DNR, Division of Water, and those are great resources for us to use. But those are fairly limited on the well logs and use of well logs, which most private wells, they drill down to as soon as they find water and they place a well. And so some of the aquifers that are below those systems have not been mapped nearly as well. And we don't have as good of a data set on that. So there is some movement towards doing some hydrostratigraphy within the state. And we're looking towards that. But as resources are always limited with our agencies, that is a challenge for us.
And another question with your data, Ginger, the location for the graph of the declining aquifer levels that you showed. Can you tell us where that was? Was it far from the river, is what this person asked?
No, I appreciate that question. And actually, I think Keith bailed me out of that by putting it on his presentation, which worked out really well. It is in Benton County. And so it is not near the Wabash directly, but is down gradient of where the Taze aquifer is from Wabash. So it would be picking up any recharge from the Wabash would be seen within that Benton County well. Further downstream, and it might go into one of these other questions, is the Mohammed Taze of Illinois, which is heavily dependent on. So this Benton monitoring well is upstream of that.
Okay, good to mention that because that's what another questioner asked, but I think that's a little complex. I'm going to go back to one at the top that neither of you covered at all, but I think it's a good point, so I just want to raise it. Michael says, I realize that water quantity is being discussed. However, there are circumstances where increased water withdrawal can affect water quality. Doesn't this need to be part of any discussion on water use? So I wonder if either of you want to say anything about that.
I mean, again, it's a complicated question without data. The 7Q10 analysis gets at that a little bit, because right, if you're at that extremely low flow and you're still trying to pull water out, well, and I think Mark indicated that you shouldn't be pulling water out at that point, but we haven't. I think he didn't. Nothing has gone beyond voluntary measures at this point. But no, I do agree, right? Water quality is a big concern, but we don't have the data to answer that question.
And I'll just curtail on for aquifer quality. Yes, we do not nearly have as much data for aquifer quality, except for in site-specific areas of the state. But there can be significant impacts and to the geochemistry as you lower water levels. You oxidize the system and it alters the water quality parameters.
Yeah, a lot more to be said on that one. So I think I'll just finish this section by asking what somebody asked in the registration of what data do we need to be collecting that we shouldn't be in order to analyze a new withdrawal like the one proposed for LEAP Lebanon. Would either of you care to make some statements about what we need to be collecting?
Ginger, you want to start? Or?
Sure. I think a better characterization of our aquifers by having higher density monitoring systems. If you look to other states, there's significant monitoring in Nebraska and Kansas because they had a need to. We are approaching that need as well, and so it'd be smart for us to increase our monitoring, which both DNR, USGS, and ourselves are in the process of trying to do with funds available. I also highly recommend that we put in more of the water balance stations as well, as we're trying to calculate these balances across the different atmosphere to surface water to groundwater. Having an accounting of all those is very important. So increased in those sorts of stations around the state for drought monitoring, flood prediction, things like that is also going to be highly helpful.
Do you want to add anything, Keith? Otherwise, we'll.
Right. We should maintain the stream flow gauges we have now. We shouldn't let them get shut down, and we should figure out how to do more water quality monitoring. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, great points. So this is the end of our brief scientist section. So thanks to both of you for showing us the complexity and the kind of data that we need. I'm now going to turn it back over to Jill to introduce our next speakers. Is that right? So that now we'll hear about policy, start here, potential policy.
Yes, thank you so much, Jane. Hi again, everybody. Just as a reminder, I'm Jill Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director for the White River Alliance. This session, we're going to move into some conversations on sustainable water use, which is a primary objective of ours at the Alliance, is to continue these conversations and then push them into policy discussions. So in this session, we're going to have an opportunity to learn about what's happening in one of our neighboring states, Ohio, as well as hear a little bit about a proposed bill brought by Representative Mike Aylesworth about this topic as well. So I'd like to just introduce our first speaker to you, Brad Lodge. Brad is the program manager for Ohio's Water Inventory and Planning Program, and he works at the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. Brad's been a program manager in his role for just about 2.5 years with the Ohio DNR. And he has graduated with an environmental geography and watershed management from the University of Arizona. So he heirs from a dry climate with his education and is now managing water here in the Midwest. So he's going to describe for us Ohio's Water Inventory and Planning Program. Brad, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience in Ohio. I'll let you just go ahead and get started.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jill. Jane, if you want to turn over control.
You should have it.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Jane. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Brad Lodge. I'm the Water Inventory and Planning Program Manager here at ODNR Division of Water Resources. We are the regulatory division for all things water quantity. I was asked to give a presentation today on Ohio's water permitting program, a high capacity water permitting program. So I'll talk a little bit about a program overview, go into the 2 permits that we do have, and then wrap it up with the changes we made to both the permits regarding groundwater in 2019. So the goal of the program is to ensure safe and reliable drinking water for all of Ohio's citizens while still maintaining activities such as recreation, future economic growth, as well as for wildlife and biology purposes. We are responsible for implementing and enforcing Ohio's rules, regulations, and contracts related to water supply and water resource development. Within the program, we house the Water Withdrawal Facility Registration Program, which is similar to what Ryan and Mark were talking about. Any facility with the capacity to withdraw over 100,000 gallons per day must register with the program and report annually. This is not a permit. This is just a registration. No money is involved. It just allows us to track water movement throughout the state. We also maintain compliance with the Great Lakes Compacts. Every year we use the data collected from the water withdrawal program to turn over to the Great Lakes Commission to show what water was used, consumed, and diverted in and out of the Great Lakes Basin. We just revamped our water conservation education and outreach. I want to give a little shameless plug here. We rolled out our State of Ohio Water Withdrawal Atlas, which is a great tool for conservation. I'll put some links in the chat for Jane to hand out. It breaks down our water use by county and Huck 8 watershed. So you can go pull any county or Huck 8 watershed and see a detailed page of the water use for those areas, whether it's groundwater, surface water, what water is being used, and then the trends dating back all the way to the beginning of the program in 1990. So I urge everybody to check that out. We also manage the water supply contracts in Ohio, specifically our up-ground reservoirs. Ohio owns quite a bit of water around the state within these reservoirs, and we administer the contracts selling that water to public water supply around the state. And lastly, we have the high capacity water use permitting, which I'm here to talk to you about today. So we'll start with our consumptive use permit, which is statewide. This has been required in Ohio Revised Code Chapter 1501 since the late 1980s. It has now moved to 1521. This requirement, any facility in Ohio that withdraws water in the amount that would result in a new or increased consumptive use of more than an average of 2 million gallons per day in a 30-day period, so 60 million gallons a month roughly, would require a permit, and this permit would need to be permitted before the consumptive use occurs. Existing permits, we've only had 4 applications in the last 30 plus years. All 4 have been within the last 5 years. 3 out of the 4 of them have been permitted, and all of them were for surface water withdrawals along the Ohio River. There were two permits for the same company. They couldn't figure out the schematic of their factory, so they relinquished 1 permit. And then we have another permit for a hydrofracking facility. So what is consumptive use? I know not every state uses the same definition. It is a portion of water that is not returned but evaporated, incorporated into a product or other processes. So you can see this chart of our consumptive use coefficients that many of the Great Lakes use. I'm pretty sure it's been adopted by many of the Great Lakes states. As you can see, you could start with quarry dewatering, which is considered 0% consumed, and that goes all the way up to hydraulic fracturing, which is considered 100% consumed. So let's say a fracking company comes to Ohio and they want 2 million gallons per day withdrawal. Since they are considered 100% consumed, they would be 2 million gallons of consumptive use, and that would require a permit. And that applies to all these coefficients here. Some determinations of approval, what the chief considers when she's going to approve or deny a permit. It will not be approved if navigable waters will be adversely impacted. The consumptive use does not incorporate maximum feasible conservation practices. It does not reasonably promote the protection of public health, safety, and welfare. The water withdrawal will have a significant detrimental effect on the quantity or quality of the water resources. And this is new, it will cause irreparable damage to an aquifer, which is defined as the aquifer not yielding the same amount of water as it did. Those are the big ticket items. There are more in ORC 1520-129, and I'll share those links later. Moving on to our water withdrawal and consumptive use permit, and this is for the Great Lakes Basin, so the Lake Erie watershed. This was required under Ohio Revised Code 1522 since 2009 as a result of the Great Lakes Compact. So generally, any new or increased withdrawal and consumptive use that averages over 1 million gallons per day over a 90-day period of inland surface water or groundwater would require a permit. The threshold is a bit higher for withdrawals directly out of Lake Erie, so that's bumped up to 2.5 MGD. Again, this must be permitted before any pumping occurs. Since 2009, we've only had 2 applications. Both have been permitted. One was relinquished. One that was relinquished never saw operations, so we didn't really get to see how that permit would play out. Both of them were for groundwater. So what is a water withdrawal and consumptive use? When the compact was established, it required each state to develop a baseline list of withdrawals and consumptive uses and capacities. So a new water withdrawal and consumptive use is one that did not exist of that compact date. An increased water withdrawal and consumptive use is one that was made by an existing facility that exceeds their capacity in the baseline list. So when they were grandfathered in under the compact. Many of the requirements are similar to the consumptive use permit that I mentioned before, until 2019, where we changed our law a bit. We bolstered our groundwater law in our code in 2019 via budget bill. Just to give you a little background of why the changes were made, we had so the citizens of Toledo were having some issue with their public water system. I think it was a pricing issue. I was not around for that time. They were concerned about a hike in the price. We had an entity come to us about 2 counties over that said, hey, I'm sitting on a high yielding aquifer. Why don't I start pumping 10 million gallons per day and sell it to the city of Toledo folks for a lot cheaper? At the time, we didn't have anything to protect the citizens or the aquifer from that happening. Luckily, that proposal fizzled out, but we realized that we needed to change our law pretty quickly to protect the citizens in the Lake Erie Basin. So we had a law in our Division of Mineral Resource Management that almost fit perfectly into what we needed to do for the Division of Water. So we took a very scientific approach to it now. The applicant must submit a groundwater model and supporting data. The chief of the division now can deny, suspend, or revoke a permit. She can also order a decrease and have the permittee submit a revised groundwater model if their monitoring plan isn't showing the predictive ability of their original model. And also, there's a waterproof replacement provision for property owners claiming loss of an existing water supply. So a little bit more detail about those things. With the groundwater model, the chief must approve the applicant's model to establish a geographic area that could be impacted by the proposed withdrawal. So generally that is the 10-foot defined by the 10-foot contour line, which is a cone of depression predicted by the applicant's model. A permit now will not be approved if the proposed withdrawal or consumptive use will result in repairable damage or destruction to an aquifer. It will not be approved if the withdrawal or consumptive use will result in significant loss of groundwater available to existing wells in the geographic area, with a caveat, and that the applicant had not identified a suitable replacement water supply. And I'll get into that in the next slide. Also, ODNR now may require the permittee to monitor groundwater levels inside and outside the geographic area, so the 10-foot contour line. And we may, the chief may suspend or revoke a permit if the continued withdrawal or consumptive use is going to damage or destruct the aquifer. A little bit more about the water replacements. So if you are a property owner within that geographic area and you experience a loss of groundwater, you can file a complaint to ODNR or the permittee. There is a rebuttable presumption that that permittee caused the loss within that geographic area. So the permittee is responsible for replacing the water supply to that property within 72 hours. And then they have 14 days to rebut that presumption. I know that's kind of confusing. I can clarify if anyone has questions. So if they are successful in their rebuttal, they can cease the water replacement supply. They are not successful, then they have to set up a permanent water replacement supply on their dime for that property owner. If you're outside of that geographic area, you can also file a complaint, but there is no rebuttable presumption, so no water replacement required. We will take that complaint and we will take our hydrogeologists and investigate ourselves and document the results. We'll send the results to the complainant and the permittee, and they can either solve it amicably between themselves or they can take it to court. So that is a high level summary of our water permits in Ohio. We are in the same boat as Indiana right now. DeWine just asked, I've got a big map in my office right here. Governor DeWine announced a mega site in Fayette County. We've got Honda and LG coming to that and many more. So we're trying to feel it out as well to figure out the best way to protect surface water, groundwater, and the citizens of Ohio. And I think it's important that we rely on our other states. We knock on each other's doors frequently, so we're not recreating the wheel. If other states have some law or permit that works well for them, so I'm happy to answer any questions, or you can email me after.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Brad.
Sure.
I really appreciate that. It's always good to hear what's going on next door. I think what we're going to do based on time, and Representative Aylesworth is with us, if we want to just go ahead and shift to hear from him a little bit about why he proposed House Bill 1556, and then we will certainly have enough time for questions for both of you after that. Let me see here. Representative Aylesworth, I saw your face on there just a minute ago, but as you're gearing up here, I'd just like to introduce you guys to Representative Aylesworth. He's been very active participant in the Indiana Water Summits and bringing a lot of water legislation forward at the State House. So Representative Mike Aylesworth represents Indiana House District 11, which is in Lake and Porter counties. And he was first elected to the House in 2014, and he currently chairs the House Agricultural and Rural Development Committees and is a member of the Environmental Affairs and the Court and Criminal Codes Committees. Prior to his service, Representative Aylesworth was a business owner in Porter County and a member of the Porter County Commissioners and president of the Indiana Corn Growers Association and the Indiana Corn Marketing Council. That's quite a resume, Mike. We're always glad to have you here and appreciate your leadership, especially in this recent session, as well with the Watershed Development Commission bill and a number of other things. So really happy to have you here. Would love to hear a little bit about the bill that you proposed and why you did that.
And you'll need to unmute.
Yep. Is that better?
Good. Thank you.
Perfect.
Okay. Oh, very good. Well, you got to bear with me. At my age, I'm not as a frequent user of higher end technology. It takes me a little while to get things warmed up. So, but anyway, thank you for having me participate and visit about some of my background and usages of water and my feelings that we need to be really protective of Indiana's groundwater as a natural resource. And I don't know that we have the data necessary to make intelligent choices when it comes to large water withdrawals in the aquifers. And I think, well, I've been involved in water issues most of my whole life, starting in 1973. I live on the Kankakee River now currently. I can look out my front door and see the Kankakee River as it flows down toward Illinois. And since I farmed most of my life, I was responsible for drainage issues, president of the county drainage board for 12 years. But as time moves on, you realize there's a much bigger picture than your little slice of the world. And now I'm in the legislature and have been now for the past 9 years. I wanted to take a more responsible look at our natural resources. And what really tipped the scale for me to drop that bill at the last minute was I remember in 1988 when we had like one of the worst droughts in northern Indiana that in my lifetime. The Prudential Farms, which is now the big dairy farm that has many thousands of cows, they installed many center pivots. And in fact, they withdrew so much water to try to save their crop, they dried up private water wells. And that was quite a to-do at the time. And as a result, in a couple of years, the legislature passed some legislation to give DNR more oversight in Jasper and Newton counties, which is where the dairy farms now are. Prudential has since sold that property. So thinking about that, and I just found out about this project with about 10 days to go before bill filing composition deadline, I should say. So I scrambled around, and there you go. Thank you, Jill. I scrambled around and had to come up with something because I wanted to start the conversation. There's been no conversation in policy or the legislature by anybody about what the proposal is at Lebanon to move water from the Tippecanoe Wabash Basin. So I hastily just did a very broad bill that gives the DNR issue a permit proposing to do work that requires more than 10 million gallons of water per day, following the DNR conducting a feasibility study examining the watershed and replenishment. So was an effort to start a conversation, which, and I heard some of the previous discussion, we really need to deeply get involved with at the policy level, as well as the financial level in the state budget, to make sure that our Department of Natural Resources has enough funding to have the test wells at different levels so they can make some scientific conclusions. As I found out when I was on the public policy nationally with the Corn Growers Association, there was always a lot of scary tactics, GMOs or frankenfoods and all that. But I learned to depend on my concept of sound science. That's why I'm so happy that Purdue's deeply involved in this at many different levels of people, because they are also believers in sound science. But in order to have sound science, you have to have data. And to acquire the data, DNR needs more resources, and I'm sure the USGS also needs more resources, so that we can do a complete study of the groundwater availability all over the state of Indiana. When I left my post in agriculture, Governor Daniels appointed me as the director of the Northern Regional Office of IDEM in South Bend, and I learned all about the aquifer with no overburden up there in the Elkhart area, and it poses its own problems of water contamination. But that's not really what we're talking about now. We're talking about deep water withdrawals, and will it have an effect on community water systems? How deep are their intakes, as well as there's a lot of small private wells on private houses or subdivisions. So that's what I thought was rolling around in my mind. I did not know it. I'm not an expert. I'm not a scientist, but I've mucked around in water a good share of my life. In fact, my first job, I always like to tell this, my first job that actually paid something, when I was 12 years old, my dad loaned me out to a fellow that was installing field tile. My job was to walk behind the tile machine, pull the clay tile off the bank and bed them with my feet, then pull dirt over them. They would cover them so they wouldn't move. And it was a very interesting job, and I learned about water firsthand when I was 12 years old. I got 10 cents a tile. I was making big money. Anyway, that's sort of my story, my background, and why the bill came up, why I decided that it was important that we do this to start the conversation. Indiana has not had any policy conversation at the legislative level, and I don't know too many legislators that are scientists and understand Indiana's water at the deep level of the aquifers that are in the legislature that could be somewhat could add to the discussion and could contribute some scientific evidence. So I guess with that, that's sort of my background and why I did this, and to start the conversation, and not only for the LEAP project in Lebanon, but for many other aquifers in the state as we become much more sophisticated and use economic development as a tool and invite industries in. They're going to need water also. And once we have the water and they use the water, then if somebody withdraws 100 million gallons a day, they're going to have to discharge the water. Should we have a policy that makes the water go back into the area where the aquifer is, or can it be discharged into another aquifer? In other words, the water came to Lebanon, does it have to be pumped back upstream to the Wabash? So those are interesting questions that there are no easy answers for, but let's start the discussion.
Yes, those are interesting questions. And I appreciate you recognizing that the speakers before you are short on data to answer them.
Yes.
Representative Aylesworth, your bill had suggested a feasibility study, which, would require having some of that information. Do you have any strategies for how we might fund something like that, or how to get such a aggressive and important initiative off the ground? And then I might go ahead.
I'm sort of at a loss because I talked to the chair of the Natural Resources Commission, and he didn't give me a hearing on the bill. So it died in the embryo stage. It was an idea that didn't go very far. But I've been working on that Water Development Commission bill for 4 or 5 years.
Right.
I'm right almost at the finish line on that in the Senate. So they should be adopted on Monday. So legislation like this that's so comprehensive and complex isn't something that just falls out of a basket and gets adopted. It's got to go through a lot of complicated processes. Not only with the policymakers, but with the decision makers that are in the professional area in DNR and IDA, anybody that deals with water. And Indiana has a very convoluted water chart. Have you seen that water chart that was put together several years ago with arrows going all over the place? And
all over the place.
Yeah. So it's going to take some time for this, but the important part of it, I got the bill filed before the filing deadline to start the conversation. So I was very happy with that.
Great. So does that mean that we could expect you to offer it again next year, or have some conversations with us in advance of that to see what kind of ideas we could come up with?
Yes, good Lord willing, at my age that I will be back next year, the legislature I intend to, my health is good. I just turned 80 years old 2 weeks ago.
Well, congratulations on that. Congratulations.
Well, I tell people, like, you got to pick your parents wisely. Good genes.
Right. Let me know how you sort that out.
Yeah. I intend to, yes.
I thought we might go back to Brad for just a minute because, you're a little bit ahead of us on this permit process, as Representative Aylesworth introduced. Did it take you guys a long time to kind of get the political support you needed for a permitting process? And did you prioritize the study of the resources themselves prior to that, or do you put that onus on the permittee who's requesting the permit?
No, I have to plead ignorance here. I'm sorry. I've only been a manager for a very short time. All of that was done prior to me assuming this position. From what I understand, the new groundwater legislation in 2019 moved pretty quickly because we had support of our state representative Hoops, and he helped get that into the budget bill pretty quickly. And I know we had a huge team working on it. We had our Division of Geological Survey, our hydrogeologists, some folks from wildlife, and we assembled a team pretty quick and got it pushed through pretty quick. But that's all that detail I know about it, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that much information. We're always trying to figure out where to start and avoid the pitfalls. Okay, I'm gonna look through some questions here in the Q&A to see if we have any proposed ones there. But I did want to ask you, Brad, if this sits in like a bigger conversation about water, because we're trying to do that in the state as we do regional studies, push for regional planning, host things like the Water Summit. Is this part of the Ohio or the H2O Ohio initiative in any way, or is this effort to manage water this way not part of that in any direct way?
H2 Ohio is kind of a funky program here at DNR. It kind of floats around. They are not involved with this in any way. There might be some future partnerships with collecting information, because I know they just started something called the Rivers Initiative, which should be gauging more rivers around Ohio. So there might be some collaboration with data sets there, but as of now, we are completely separate.
Okay, well, thank you for that. So Representative Aylesworth, do you think when you look at introducing a permit program, we tend to have some often objectives, or people object to more regulation in the state. Do you think we start with the evaluation of the resources, or do we start with the regulation of the resource?
I think we need to collect the data and have good solid data. Like I said, sound science is very important. Then you can talk to policymakers with the sound science in hand to have them come to their own logical conclusion, because most senior policymakers rely on good data. To go off without the good data is a little bit like flying in a glider. It goes so far so good, and then sometimes it doesn't, you know. So I think we ought to do that first, and that's some resources.
Some resources toward our agencies. Yeah, certainly get support from groups like ours for that. One other question I had as I was looking at 1556 for you that might be of interest to the group is it focused on groundwater withdrawals. And Brad, maybe this goes for you as well. Do you see the surface water withdrawals sort of in the same vein when you're thinking about, you know, either having these feasibility studies done before such a use would happen, or do either of you want to weigh in as to whether or not the priority is groundwater at the moment or surface water or both?
Go ahead, Brad.
At the time in 2019, the groundwater was obviously the priority. We are wanting to catch up our surface water laws with our groundwater laws and make them come from a more scientific approach instead of just gauging health, safety, and welfare of Ohio citizens. So hopefully in the future we can catch up our surface water law, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. I have a similar feeling. It'll be groundwater would be first, and then tag along is surface water.
We really just wanted to take a scientific approach, and we are lacking that a bit on our surface water list.
So I have one last question, and then I want to give all of our speakers a chance to offer some last comments. But Brad, you had mentioned the Toledo water example that, and often in policy, it takes a good crisis to get the conversation going, right? Was it that event for you guys, or were there other things going on in the state that prompted this? Because it seems like to get political support, it might not need to be a one-off. And I guess then conversely, I would ask Representative Ellsworth, is, you know, the conversation with the LEAP Lebanon project, is that what has sparked this for you, or is this you know, just a slow burn over time as we have been, you know, had the luxury of using our water resources without thinking about all of these topics? So Brad first, was that the crisis? And Representative Ellsworth, where are we on that scale?
Yes, that was the specific event that sparked the 2019 budget bill. As I mentioned, you know, in the last 30 years, it's been the last 5 years where we've seen an uptick in applications. We didn't see any for 25 years. So this new boom in industry is going to really be something that we need to think about and start making some plans for.
Yeah, I certainly take a number of calls from our communities about that, you know, who are entertaining economic development initiatives from people that are leaving the Western states looking for water supplies for their businesses. So I think, yeah, it's going to continue to be a conversation. Representative Ellsworth, was it this project in particular, or because of all your other experiences, is this sort of thing, do you just see it becoming a more frequent conversation topic?
It was always sort of an orphan child in the background, lurking in the background, but I had no reason to feel that it was extremely important that it come forward until the LEAP project popped up. In my longevity in life, I vividly remember that drought that killed all the trees we see between the northbound and southbound lanes up by Fair Oaks Farms and the dairies. Yeah, they died, and the farm or the homes in Fair Oaks lost their water. And so this project, and people want to withdraw a lot of water. Boom! Where's the sound science here to tell us what's available and what's not available? So that's why it popped up. It was my memory of that event.
Well, I appreciate that. It's funny, when we started pulling this effort together, it occurred to me that it's not well known to everybody how the system works, you know, that these water withdrawals and the registration at DNR, but that it's not permitted, you know, and we see use inside our subbasins inside the White all the time, you know, taking out in one subbasin and returning to another. And so I think that what sparked this conversation was just a change of scale. So I wonder, as we go forward, you know, is it that there's now a conversation or concern or competition between regions versus, the fact that we do that locally inside a basin quite frequently. So I think you're right. Sound science seems to be a great place to start from. With that, I'm trying to also watch chat here as well and encourage our speakers to answer any questions they can. But I wanted to give our panelists a chance to kind of come back around before we adjourn for the day and share any last thoughts that you guys might have. So I thought it might go in the reverse order since I already have you, Representative Aylesworth, on the hook here. Any last thoughts you have about these water use issues, transfers, policy, future concerns that you'd like to share with the group?
You're asking?
Yes, if you just have any, you don't have to respond, but if you have any sort of closing thoughts or big picture thoughts for us,
big picture thoughts is the issue has now come up and made a little bit more public and risen to the surface. We need to pursue this now in the future with the help of the panelists I see right there. We do need more data, and we need to collect stuff that we can make a good sound scientific judgment as to whether this is harmful to the environment, whether extremely high draws can lead to water degradation issues, all kinds of things like that. We're not clear on, because we've never, in the course of human events and nature, we haven't had the ability nor the reason to dive into this. Mm-hmm. So it'll be a complex issue, and I hope it keeps moving forward.
I appreciate that sentiment. There's a question about whether it's supported by the budget bill, so I'll let you, we can stew on that one in a little bit here. Brad, any thoughts from you as you look at what we're dealing with over here from your perspective?
I just want to stress that, it's important to rely on our sister states. A lot of us are going through the same issues right now. A lot of us are seeing this boom in industrial water use. We're talking to Pennsylvania and West Virginia right now, and they're coming up with some great ideas for us. So just, why reinvent the wheel if others I have some permitting program or some great ideas for Indiana to use, and I'm happy to help. And my email will be on whatever Jane sends out, so feel free to send me any questions you may have. And thank you for having me.
Yes, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate the camaraderie. I'm going to go over to Keith and see if Keith, you have any last thoughts for us today as we kind of close up here?
I mean, sorry, I've been dealing with all of these questions. They're great questions.
They are, aren't they? I know.
And I can't type fast enough to respond to them all. But I just like to reiterate, right? Indiana is blessed with water. We just, right, what the real conversation is how do we want to best use it and manage it to support all the things that we in the state want. And I'll close it there.
Yeah, that's certainly true. When I showed you guys that map at the beginning, I do that when I go do talks, because it's a slice of life, right? It shows you that even to turn the power on in your house, we need water, and to go to your job. And so these users aren't just somebody behind a curtain, they're all of us. So appreciate those comments, Keith. Ginger, you want to offer any insights or last thoughts here?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think twofold. I appreciate Representative Ellsworth's sentiment on sound science and with acceptable methods and non-biased, neutral scientists leading that charge. So I think that's very important. So thank you very much for those comments. And then I'd also like to bring up the idea of a one water concept, and the idea that we should be managing water resources of every different level that has to do with water, with a community conversation as to what our goals and needs are behind water, and look at it as a holistic approach to managing that resource. So I'd like to bring the One Water Indiana conversation into this and move that needle forward as well.
Yeah, certainly support that. Those are both regional and statewide conversations we hope to keep having. Thank you for that. Okay, I think that takes me to Mark, maybe. Mark, thoughts for today? You busy answering questions as well?
I can't type that fast. So
I know.
yeah, I think it's been reiterated over and over in this discussion, certainly the importance of monitoring data. And, we saw the USGS monitoring network impacted back in the early 2000s, 2003, where we, got rid of about 2/3 of the data that we had through those wells. And again, the foresight of the legislature to bump that back up with a volunteer monitoring network, that's really helped. In fact, a lot of those wells that were previously monitored or were re-equipped. And so, we went from like 92 groundwater monitoring wells to 35, and then now we're back up to that 90 or so with the volunteer network. And I think particularly in the work that we do here with the water rights law, the water use program, seeing the impacts and being able to evaluate the impacts to the groundwater resource in particular with that data is extremely important.
Hey, Mark, let me just weigh in that, because that's actually a topic we focused on one year at the summit. Those wells that were taken off and then some put back on through volunteer, that number was still wildly low from, say, what Michigan does or that sort of thing. Do we, if Representative Aylesworth or other either leaders or funding sources are we prepared to know what we need? Do we have a good gap analysis, a way to say, here's our wish list, Representative Aylesworth, get us these wells back, or get us these many gauges put in? Does that exist anywhere?
Well, I think there is an effort to do that. There's a group that's meeting, looking at the groundwater monitoring program, or the water monitoring program here in the state currently, and looking at criteria for determining sites. And, a lot of it's pretty much a no-brainer. You want to put it in areas where you maybe got some active pumping or significant, aquifer systems. But yeah, that is something that's being done to evaluate the current network and to look at expanding it. Yes.
Well, we will hope to use this forum to lift that effort further, for sure. Ryan, I know you had a few things you wanted to share, and welcome back.
Thank you, Jill. And, most everybody today has touched on what I was going to touch on, which is the importance of not only groundwater and surface water data, but really data from the entire hydrologic cycle. So those water balance stations that Ginger referred to, that's very important. But I think maybe a twist on this is what we can consider maybe as an action item for the group, which is, while we all agree, I think the message really needs to be clear and consistent among the various scientists, stakeholders, when communicating the needs and benefits of not only maintaining the network, as Keith said, but investing in Indiana's water networks in the future. So perhaps refining a unified message detailing the importance of need for these networks and data should be considered a follow-up action item for today. And I promise Jill didn't pay me to say this, but that theme and a few other themes have been included in the Indiana Water Summit's white paper that was developed in 2022. And so not only does the need for data and science appear as a theme, but also this whole topic about regional planning. We really haven't touched much on water quality issues today. That's also part of this more broad discussion. And so if you haven't attended the Indiana Water Summit, I urge you to do that, because Jill and her team really do a good job in trying to get input like we've done today from stakeholders prior to the meeting, and then be able to answer some of those questions at the meeting. So again, just wanted to say that is a terrific forum that's ongoing. It's really been useful, I think, for a lot of people, and you get a very broad audience with not only the folks like us, the scientists and others, the policymakers, but legislators, and then importantly, the water use community and the public. So I'd like to just end there. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I didn't pay Ryan to say that, but I did want to bring up that, as you guys know, we did have some other speakers hoping to talk about the LEAP Lebanon project in more detail, and we just don't have the data for that right now. But we have invited them to the summit and expect them to be there to help share, which will hopefully have, that project will have advanced its study approach and actually put some wells in the ground at that point. So we look forward to continuing that conversation with more specifics at the Water Summit, which is what we will do on our regional day. So If you haven't had enough today, come back. We'll get you some more. With that, we have just a few minutes left, and I did want to give Jane a chance to weigh in. She was the one that initiated a lot of interest in hosting this conversation. So, Jane, would you like to share some thoughts with us?
Yeah, thanks, Jill, and thanks to everyone. When we started thinking what we could do that would be useful, we realized right away that we didn't have enough data to really analyze this LEAP Lebanon project. But what it does do is provide an opportunity to talk about two gaps that that you have already mentioned. One is obviously the data gap, the investment that the state is making compared with what we need is not there. And then the other gap is that we have no policy that would address that. And I'm so appreciative of Representative Aylesworth introducing a bill and coming on and speaking about it. That's been really interesting. So Purdue's Institute for a Sustainable Future, and then I am in Purdue Extension, and so I have a particular commitment to bringing up these conversations and sharing science as we can to advance the conversation. We're really pleased to be able to do this and perhaps do more. So I put a link to a short survey where we welcome any feedback. You'll see it in the chat. I hope that's shown to all of you. We'll also email it out, but this is a good time to do it. Just a few quick questions, including one I always like what was surprising? Because hopefully we've learned something that you didn't expect, along with many things that you probably did. So again, Jill is right that this is not new, but it is a new scale. And certainly it's been a great opportunity to have some conversations that should benefit us in the future. Thanks. And back to Jill.
Okay. Thank you, Jane. I was just scrolling the Q&A. Folks were asking if the Q&A questions would be available afterwards. We will do our best to do that. And I am taking note of some of the topics that maybe we didn't have the right people on to answer, but might be good future topics for us. So we will, please trust, we'll do our best to get you answers or to bring those topics back up in another discussion forum when we can get the right people there. So with that, our water community is stronger for doing stuff like this. Thank you guys for giving up your Friday afternoon to put a couple hundred people into a conversation about this. I think is a giant step forward. So thanks to Purdue as well and our speakers. And I hope you guys have a fantastic weekend, and we will see you at the next event.